Who are you? Start off with.
My name is Brayley Chambers. I'm originally from Athens, Alabama. I've been in the Middle Tennessee area for 10 years. I went to college at Lipscomb University, got there in 2013, and studied philosophy and theology there. And when I was there, I met my wife, Gabby, who is now a nurse practitioner. The way that I think about philosophy is it is essentially just the discipline of thinking incredibly hard about some of the most important things in life. So, this is why you have different subdivisions within philosophy. You have philosophy of religion, you have philosophy of science, you have philosophy of art, and each one of those is asking fundamental questions about each of those disciplines. So when it comes to philosophy of religion, for example, you're answering the question of, does God exist? If God does exist, can we know He exists? What kind of God is He? And then also you have another subdivision called epistemology, and in epistemology that's all about the fundamental questions of knowledge. So how do we know things? Can we know anything? What makes a statement true? Fundamental questions about some of the most important things in life. So are there universal moral laws? I absolutely do think so. And I would imagine that most people today actually do believe so as well. I think most people, if you were to ask, is it wrong to drop kick babies for fun? They would say absolutely. So there are absolutely moral laws that do exist. I do think God exists. I think there's actually a lot of philosophically sound reasons for believing in the existence of God. That's one of the reasons I'm a Christian. And I think that if you study the history of Western philosophy, some of the best philosophers in the history of the world have been believers in a God. So, for example, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle all believed in a God. They were not atheists. And then if you keep on studying the history of Western philosophy, you have Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, numerous, St. Augustine, Rene Descartes. Many of the best philosophers in the history of the world have believed in a God. Yeah, so political philosophy, as I was talking about, it's very similar to philosophy of religion or philosophy of science. Political philosophy is all about some of the most fundamental questions related to politics. So, for example, in political philosophy, one of the questions that's asked frequently is what makes a government a legitimate government? If I'm remembering correctly, somebody like John Locke would say, well, in order for a government to be legitimate, you would have to have a certain amount of, what's the word I'm looking for here? Consent? Yeah, you'd have to have a certain amount of consent by the people to have this government over them. And so, political philosophy is all about answering questions such as that. Is what makes a government a legitimate government as opposed to a tyrannical government? Also, very similar questions, which would be, at what point, if any, are people morally justified in rebelling against such government? My favorite philosophers to read of all time, definitely Plato would be up there. Plato's fun to read. I think a lot of times when people think of philosophy, they think, oh, this is going to be very difficult to understand. That's not always the case. Plato, for the most part, is actually fun and pretty accessible. In addition to Plato, I love St. Augustine, who is a philosopher and a theologian. He's one of the most brilliant Christians I think who's ever lived. He's had a huge impact on Christian theology. In more recent years, there is a great Christian apologist by the name of William Lane Craig, who is a professor at a seminary out in California, and he is very, very brilliant and does some very important work as well. Yeah, so here are three of my favorite books in philosophy, one of which is by the great British It's by the great British philosopher John Locke, who had a huge impact on America's founding fathers. He was a Christian. A lot of people don't know that. And he wrote an entire book on the reasonableness of Christianity. And the entire book is about why he believes that Christianity is indeed a reasonable faith. And he argues for this really by the historical account of the resurrection of Jesus. So that's a great book, a very small book that I find very interesting. Another book that's great is called Where the Conflict Really Lies, and this is by a guy named Alvin Plantinga. He's a philosopher at the University of Notre Dame. This book is published by Oxford Press, and this entire book is about where the conflict really lies between science, religion, and naturalism. I think a lot of people in our society today think that there's just this huge conflict between science and Christianity. Plantinga in this book, I think, does a really good job of saying that that's not really the case. There are some very superficial disagreements that science has with Christianity, potentially, regarding, depending on how one interprets Genesis 1, the age of the earth. So that's like a superficial conflict, but the more one really digs into Christianity, the more that you realize how much science and Christianity actually really get along very well, which is why some of the best some of the best scientists in the history of science have been Christians. And so, very great book talking about how Christianity and science are very compatible, and how science and naturalism, which is the belief that God doesn't exist and all that exists is the natural world, how that worldview actually has a lot of problems doing real science. If God doesn't exist, it's actually a lot more difficult to do science than some people might initially realize. Science has a lot of assumptions that make a lot of sense given a world created by a God that is a logical God who created the world in a logical kind of way. But if you don't have assumptions like that, there's actually some serious questions about whether or not science is actually possible. And so, very interesting book, published by Oxford by the great Notre Dame philosopher Alvin Plantinga. And then this is another great book, Ronald Nash. He's was a philosopher up at Western Kentucky University. Faith and Reason. And this entire book is really all about how much evidence we have for believing in God, and where faith kicks in and where reason kicks in when thinking about religion. So strongly recommend all three of those books. Yeah. My life philosophy really can be summed up in the first question and answer of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, which is that the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And so much of philosophy is trying to answer fundamental questions, such as, why am I here? What should I do with my life? The first question and answer of the Westminster Catechism really answers that by saying the purpose of man, and your purpose, is to glorify God and enjoy God forever.